The council chamber was silent, heavy with the kind of quiet that makes you hold your breath without realizing it. Around me, the most powerful leaders from across the galaxy sat rigid, their expressions unreadable. A single sentence had been spoken, a reminder, not a debate. "It is law. Do not approach the humans." That was it. No long explanation, no room for negotiation. The decree had been in place for centuries, long before I was born. It was as ancient as the stars themselves, etched into the very fabric of interstellar governance. Yet no one dared to ask why, at least not out loud. The humans were to be left alone, their borders respected, their worlds untouched. To break this law was unthinkable, not because of the punishment handed down by the council, but because of the consequences humanity itself might deliver. Still, curiosity gnawed at me. It always had. I'd spent years piecing together fragments of information, scraps of stories that barely hinted at the truth. The humans weren't the largest empire. They didn't have fleets that blotted out the stars or weapons that could rip holes in the fabric of reality. They weren't even the oldest species. And yet, every civilization in the galaxy, from the smallest colony to the grandest empire, feared them. Some called them masters of war, but even that felt like an understatement. The stories, those few that were allowed to be shared, painted them as something far more dangerous. They were survivors, fighters who thrived in chaos and destruction. It wasn't just their technology or their strategy. It was something deeper, something primal. They didn't fight like us. They didn't think like us. The first time I'd heard about humans, I was a young officer on a trading vessel. We were in orbit around a neutral planet, negotiating the sale of rare minerals, when an elder from another species joined the conversation. She was old, with eyes that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 lifetimes. Out of nowhere, she warned us, her voice barely above a whisper. "If you ever see a human, leave. Do not speak to them. Do not look at them. Leave and pray they do not follow." At the time, I laughed it off. Humans were just another species, weren't they? Fragile creatures, limited by their biology, reliant on their technology. But as I rose through the ranks, I began to see the patterns. Entire fleets rerouted their courses to avoid human space. Alliances were formed and dissolved. Wars were fought and forgotten, but humanity remained untouched, their borders inviolate. It wasn't until I joined the Council's Military Advisory Board that I started to understand just how deep the fear went. There were classified records accounts from species who had ignored the law, who had approached the humans despite the warnings. None of them survived. One report, in particular, haunted me. It described a fleet of invaders, one of the most advanced in the galaxy at the time. They believed they could overpower the humans, that their superior numbers and firepower would crush any resistance. But the humans didn't fight the way they expected. They didn't meet the invaders head-on in grand battles. Instead, they struck from the shadows, hitting supply lines, sabotaging key systems, dismantling the fleet piece by piece. The invaders never even saw them coming. By the time they realized what was happening, it was too late. Entire ships vanished without a trace. The survivors described the humans as ghosts, relentless and unstoppable. But it wasn't just their tactics that terrified me. It was the mindset behind them. Humans didn't fight for conquest or glory. They fought to win, no matter the cost. To them, war wasn't a game or a contest. It was survival, and they treated it as such. I thought back to one of the oldest records in the archives, a human saying that had been translated into countless languages, "In war, there are no rules." That philosophy was what made them so dangerous. They didn't follow the conventions or traditions that other species adhered to. They adapted, innovated, and improvised in ways no one could predict. And yet, for all their ferocity, there was another side to them, one that made them even more enigmatic. Humans were capable of incredible acts of compassion and mercy. They formed alliances, shared their knowledge, and helped rebuild worlds devastated by war. It was this duality that made them impossible to understand. How could a species so capable of destruction also be so profoundly empathetic? These thoughts swirled in my mind as I sat in the council chamber, listening to the proceedings. A delegation from a smaller species had brought forward a request, a proposal to establish trade routes through human space. It was a bold move, one that violated the law in spirit if not in letter. The council rejected it without hesitation. "The risk is too great," one of the elder statesmen said. "We cannot afford to provoke them." The delegation protested, arguing that humanity hadn't shown hostility in centuries. But that was precisely the point. The humans didn't need to. The fear of what they could do was enough to keep the entire galaxy in line. I found myself wondering, as I often did, what would happen if the law were broken. If someone dared to cross the invisible line humanity had drawn around itself. Would the humans respond with the same ruthless efficiency described in the stories? Or had they changed, grown softer over the centuries of peace? Before I could dwell on the thought, a notification appeared on my personal console. A fleet had been detected near human space. It wasn't one of ours. My blood ran cold. Someone was about to test the law. The room felt colder as the notification lingered on my console, its message glaring like a beacon. A fleet had been detected near human space, moving steadily toward one of their outer colonies. The screen didn't provide many details, just the size of the fleet and its trajectory. But that alone was enough to send a chill down my spine. Whoever they weren't from the Council or any allied species. These ships belonged to an independent faction, and they were either bold or foolish enough to ignore the law. I wasn't the only one who noticed. Around me, murmurs spread through the chamber like ripples on a still pond. Even the most stoic members of the council exchanged uneasy glances. No one wanted to say it out loud, but the same thought hung in the air between us. This is going to end badly. I quickly scanned the data, trying to make sense of it. The fleet wasn't massive, but it wasn't small either. A force of about 50 ships, heavily armed and moving with purpose. Their target appeared to be one of the smaller human settlements on the fringes of their territory, a colony that, by all accounts, was little more than a mining outpost. Strategically insignificant, but perhaps that was the point. They must think it's a weak spot, I thought. A place where they could test the waters without drawing too much attention. They couldn't have been more wrong. The humans rarely shared details about their colonies, but the few reports we had suggested they treated even their smallest outposts like fortresses. Every settlement, no matter how remote, was prepared for an attack. And while the humans didn't flaunt their military might, everyone knew their response to any provocation was swift and devastating. Still, part of me hoped this wouldn't escalate. Maybe the fleet was just passing through, unaware of the territory they were entering. Maybe they'd turn back before crossing the line. But deep down, I knew better. Factions like this didn't operate on caution. They thrived on arrogance and ambition, and both would lead them straight into disaster. I turned my attention back to the council. The murmurs had grown louder, tension crackling in the air. One of the senior members finally raised their voice, cutting through the noise. "We need to intervene," they said firmly. "If we don't, the consequences could affect us all." Intervene? The idea was almost laughable. No one interfered in human affairs. That was another unspoken rule, born from the same fear that kept us from approaching them in the first place. But the senior member wasn't wrong. If this rogue fleet triggered a human response, the fallout could ripple across the galaxy. "What would you suggest?" another member asked, their tone sharp with skepticism. "Send a warning. They've already ignored the law. Do you think they'll listen to us now?" The debate spiraled from there, arguments overlapping as frustration mounted. Some called for diplomacy, others for more drastic measures. But through it all, one truth remained: none of us had any real power to stop what was about to happen. As the voices around me grew louder, I felt a knot tightening in my chest. It wasn't just fear, it was something deeper, a gnawing sense of dread I couldn't shake. I'd seen this before, though only in fragments of history. Stories of those who had underestimated the humans, who believed they could outsmart or overpower them. Every time, it ended the same way. The humans didn't start wars, but they knew how to finish them. I left the chamber before the debate reached its inevitable deadlock. Outside, the corridors were quieter, the distant hum of the station's engines the only sound. I needed space to think, to process what was happening. But no matter how I tried to frame it, I kept coming back to the same question: why would anyone risk provoking the humans? The answer, I realized, was as old as the galaxy itself. Greed, arrogance, the belief that you could take what you wanted without consequences. Whoever commanded that fleet, they saw the humans as a challenge to be conquered, not a force to be respected. They thought they could win. I couldn't decide whether to pity them or curse their stupidity. The fleet's location and trajectory replayed in my mind as I walked. They were still days away from human space, but it wouldn't be long before they crossed the threshold. And once they did, I didn't want to imagine what might happen next. A sharp tone from my communicator broke my train of thought. I hesitated before answering, knowing it would likely be more bad news. Sure enough, it was an update from the station's monitoring division. "The fleet has accelerated," the officer reported, their voice tight with urgency. "At this rate, they'll reach human space within 72 hours. I closed my eyes, taking a slow breath. Have there been any transmissions? None so far. They're running silent. Typical. An old tactic, designed to mask intent and avoid detection until the last possible moment. But it wouldn't fool the humans. Nothing ever did. I thanked the officer and ended the call, my thoughts racing. The humans probably already knew about the fleet. Their surveillance technology was leagues ahead of anything we had. If they hadn't responded yet, it was because they were waiting for what? I couldn't say. That was the thing about humans. They didn't rush. They didn't act out of panic or desperation. They observed, calculated, and struck only when the time was right. And when they did, it was always decisive. Back in my quarters, I pulled up the classified archives, searching for anything that might give me insight into what was about to unfold. The records were sparse, heavily redacted, but what little remained painted a grim picture. The humans didn't fight for conquest or resources. They fought for survival, and that made them dangerous in ways most species couldn't comprehend. A phrase from one of the reports stood out, stark against the page. Humans do not seek war, but when war comes to them, they ensure it never comes again. I stared at the words, the weight of them settling over me like a shroud. This wasn't just about the rogue fleet. It was about what would happen after. The humans wouldn't just defeat them, they'd make an example of them. The galaxy would watch, as it always did, and the fear that kept us all in line would deepen. But for how long? How many more rogue factions would rise, believing they could succeed where others had failed? And how many more times could humanity endure before something finally broke? I didn't have answers, only questions that twisted like a storm in my mind. Outside, the stars burned brightly, oblivious to the chaos unfolding in their light. Somewhere out there, 50 ships hurtled toward their fate, unaware that they were about to awaken a force far beyond their understanding. And somewhere beyond them, the humans were waiting. The days that followed felt like they stretched endlessly, the weight of what was coming pressing down on me. News of the rogue fleet spread quickly, whispers echoing through the corridors of the station. Everyone knew what it meant, though no one dared to say it out loud. The humans wouldn't let this slide. They couldn't. The fleet had crossed the border into human space. They made no attempt to disguise their intentions anymore, sending out a single broadcast as they approached the mining colony. It was a demand for surrender, arrogant, dismissive, almost mocking. "Relinquish your resources, and no harm will come to you," the message had said, echoing in the council chamber when it was played back. I couldn't help but wonder if the humans were laughing when they heard it. The colony didn't respond. Not a single word. The silence was louder than any reply could have been, a statement in itself. The fleet continued forward, undeterred, their confidence seemingly growing with every unanswered transmission. To them, it must have felt like a victory already. For us, it was the calm before the storm. I spent hours poring over every detail I could find about the colony, trying to anticipate what might happen. It was a small settlement, home to only a few hundred humans surrounded by barren, resource-rich terrain. On the surface, it seemed defenseless, with no visible signs of military infrastructure. But that was the problem. The humans were never as they seemed. The reports were contradictory, at best. Some described their colonies as peaceful, with no weapons to speak of. Others claimed they were traps, designed to lure invaders into a false sense of security before striking. I didn't know which version was true, and that terrified me more than anything. The rogue fleet reached the colony on the 4th day. From what little intelligence we could gather, they began deploying their forces almost immediately, sending smaller ships to encircle the settlement. There was no resistance, no sign of the humans even acknowledging their presence. It was as if the colony was abandoned, lifeless and still. But I knew better. The silence stretched on, unbearable in its intensity. No one in the council chamber spoke, every eye fixed on the live feed from the monitoring stations. The rogue fleet's commanders must have been emboldened by the lack of resistance, because they soon began landing ground troops near the colony. I could imagine them, armored and armed, marching across the dusty terrain with smug confidence. And then it began. It wasn't a sudden explosion or a dramatic battle cry. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible. Communications between the fleet's ships began to falter, their signals cutting in and out. The ground troops reported strange malfunctions in their equipment scanners failing, weapons refusing to fire, navigation systems leading them in circles. The fleet's commanders tried to adapt, issuing orders to regroup and assess the situation. But the more they tried to regain control, the worse it became. Entire squads disappeared without a trace, their last transmissions filled with confusion and fear. Ships in orbit reported seeing nothing, no movement, no signs of an attack. And yet, one by one, their forces were being dismantled. It was terrifyingly precise. I watched in stunned silence as the rogue fleet unraveled, their confidence crumbling into panic. They had come expecting a fight, a clear enemy they could overpower with brute force. Instead, they were being picked apart by something they couldn't see or understand. The council members around me were equally silent, their faces pale and tense. We all knew what this meant. The humans weren't just responding, they were making a statement. The feed from the ground troops finally went dark, their last report cutting off mid-sentence. Whatever was happening down there, it was over now. All that remained were the ships in orbit, their commanders frantically trying to retreat. But the humans didn't let them. From the edge of the system, something emerged, a fleet of human ships. Their sleek, unassuming designs almost modest compared to the extravagant warships of other species. They didn't look like much, but that only made them more unsettling. The rogue fleet's remaining ships tried to flee, scattering in all directions. It didn't matter. The humans moved with terrifying efficiency, cutting off their escape routes and disabling their engines with surgical precision. They didn't destroy the ships outright, not yet. They were sending a message, one that would echo across the galaxy. The rogue fleet's flagship managed to send out a final transmission before it was captured. The voice of its commander was shaky, desperate. "We didn't know. Please, we didn't know." The transmission ended abruptly, the feed cutting to static. In the chamber, no one spoke. The weight of what we'd just witnessed was suffocating, the implications too vast to process all at once. This wasn't just a defeat. It was a warning, a reminder of why the law existed in the first place. Humans didn't start wars, but when war came to them, they didn't hesitate to end it. As the silence stretched on, I found myself thinking about the colony, the people who lived there, who had gone about their lives as this unfolded around them. Did they feel fear, or was this simply routine for them? I couldn't imagine living with that kind of confidence, knowing that no matter what happened, your enemies would never walk away unscathed. But there was something else, too, something deeper. For all their strength, the humans didn't act out of malice. Their response had been calculated, precise, designed to neutralize the threat without unnecessary destruction. It was a show of power, yes, but also restraint. The humans could have annihilated the fleet, wiped it from existence without a trace. Instead, they left survivors enough to carry the story back to the galaxy, to ensure that no one else would make the same mistake. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The rogue fleet's actions would have consequences, ripples that would spread far beyond this single encounter. The humans had been tested, and they'd proven once again why they were to be left alone. But for how long? How many more factions would rise, blinded by ambition or desperation? How many more times would the humans be forced to remind the galaxy of what they were capable of? As I stared at the empty screen, the rogue fleet's fate etched into my memory, I realized that the true question wasn't whether the humans would endure. It was whether the rest of us could live with what we had created, a galaxy where fear of one species held us all in check. And somewhere out there, beyond the borders we dared not cross, the humans were watching. The chamber was quiet now, but the silence wasn't peace. It was tension so thick it felt like the air itself was pressing down on us. The humans had made their statement, loud and clear, but the ripple effects were already starting. As I left the council room, my communicator buzzed urgently. It was a coded priority message, the kind reserved for emergencies, and my stomach tightened as I opened it. It wasn't about the humans. Not directly. It was worse. The rogue fleet wasn't acting alone. That much was clear now. Surveillance data, pulled from the remains of their captured ships, revealed encrypted communications with a larger network, a faction hidden deep in uncharted space, one that had been amassing resources and allies for years. Their fleet was just a scouting party, a test to see how the humans would respond. And now they had their answer. I hurried to the monitoring station, my mind racing. If this rogue faction was preparing for something bigger, then the humans weren't the only ones at risk. The balance of the entire galaxy could be thrown into chaos. But as the data unfolded before me, I realized the situation was even more dire than I'd imagined. The faction wasn't just watching humanity, they were studying them. Reports of their operations detailed strange, disturbing experiments. They had captured humans, isolated them, and tried to replicate their combat strategies, their resilience, even their ability to survive in hostile environments. They wanted to understand what made humans so dangerous, to weaponize it for themselves. It was a gamble, one that bordered on madness. But the results were chilling. Fragmented footage showed engineered soldiers undergoing brutal training regimens, their tactics eerily similar to those of human forces. It wasn't perfect. There were gaps in their understanding, flaws in their attempts to mimic human behavior. But it was close enough to be terrifying. The council was notified immediately. The data was presented, the implications laid bare. But the room remained divided. Some argued for immediate action, to warn the humans and form an alliance against the growing threat. Others hesitated, fearful of drawing humanity's attention to our own vulnerabilities. "The humans don't need us," one member said bluntly. "They've proven that time and time again. If we interfere, we'll only make ourselves targets. But if we do nothing," another countered, "this rogue faction will grow stronger. They won't stop at humans. They'll come for all of us." The debate spiraled into chaos, voices rising and overlapping until a sharp tone cut through the noise. It was the station's emergency alert system blaring across the chamber. I turned to the central console, my heart pounding. A new fleet had appeared on the outskirts of human space. Larger than the first, heavily armed, and moving with unsettling precision. It wasn't the humans, it was them. The rogue faction had sent their main force, and they weren't holding back this time. Panic erupted in the chamber. The humans were powerful, yes, but even they couldn't withstand an assault of this magnitude, not without devastating losses. And if humanity fell, the rogue faction's newfound strength would turn them into an unstoppable force. I left the chamber before the arguments could resume, my mind racing. There was no time for politics or hesitation. The humans needed to know what was coming. As I prepared to send an encrypted message, a new thought struck me, a realization that made my blood run cold. What if the humans already knew? They had been watching the rogue fleet from the beginning, their surveillance capabilities far beyond anything we could imagine. If they had intercepted the faction's communications, they might have seen this coming long before we did. But if that was true, why hadn't they acted? Why hadn't they sent reinforcements to the colony or launched a preemptive strike against the faction's stronghold? The answer hit me like a thunderbolt. They were waiting. Not for help, not for us to intervene, but for the faction to reveal itself. The humans were letting this play out, drawing their enemies into the open, studying their tactics and weaknesses. It wasn't fear or hesitation, it was strategy. The rogue faction thought they were the ones observing humanity. I sent the message anyway, a desperate attempt to warn them of the fleet's size and strength. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't make a difference. The humans didn't need our information. They were already 10 steps ahead. As the hours passed, the tension grew unbearable. The rogue faction's fleet reached the edge of the human colony, their ships forming an ominous wall in orbit. This time, there were no demands, no attempts at negotiation. They fired without warning, their weapons tearing through the colony's surface with brutal efficiency. For a moment, I thought they'd succeeded. The colony was silent, its structures reduced to rubble. But then, like the calm before a storm, everything changed. The humans responded. It wasn't just a fleet this time, it was an armada, emerging from hyperspace with precision that bordered on surgical. Their ships surrounded the rogue faction's forces, cutting off any chance of escape. And then they unleashed hell. The battle that followed was unlike anything I'd ever seen. The humans didn't just fight, they overwhelmed. Their weapons were devastating, their tactics flawless, their movements so coordinated it was as if they operated with a single mind. But even as the rogue faction's ships fell one by one, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the climax. It was too perfect, too calculated. The humans were holding back, controlling the chaos with terrifying precision. And that's when the second twist hit me. The humans weren't just fighting to destroy the rogue fleet. They were capturing it. I watched in stunned silence as ship after ship was disabled, their crews taken alive. The humans were gathering them, collecting their enemies like pieces on a game board. But for what purpose, I couldn't say. Whatever their plan was, it was far beyond anything I could comprehend. And as the battle raged on, one thought consumed me. The humans weren't just fighting to survive. They were preparing for something bigger. The rogue faction's fleet was shattered, its ships disabled and adrift, as the human armada loomed above the battlefield. But the humans weren't celebrating. There was no sense of triumph in their movements, no trace of the arrogance the rogue faction had carried into this fight. Instead, there was purpose, cold, deliberate, and deeply unsettling. One by one, the disabled ships were towed toward a central hub, a massive human vessel that dwarfed even the largest of their warships. Its surface bristled with unknown technology, glowing faintly as the captured ships were drawn inside. There were no explosions, no executions, only silence as the humans collected their spoils. I stared at the live feed, my mind racing. What were they doing? Why take prisoners when they could have ended this conflict entirely? It didn't make sense until the rogue faction's own transmissions revealed the truth. Hidden among their encrypted messages was a desperate signal sent from one of the captured ships. The crew begged for rescue, but the words that followed were what caught my attention. "They're not interrogating us," the voice said, trembling. "They're studying us." The humans weren't just dismantling the rogue faction, they were learning from them. Every ship, every soldier, every fragment of their technology was being absorbed, analyzed, and understood. The humans weren't reacting to the threat. They were evolving because of it. I turned back to the council, but no one had answers. We were all spectators now, powerless to intervene as the humans executed their plan. And as more reports came in, the full scale of their operation became clear. The rogue faction hadn't just been targeting humanity, they had allies scattered across the galaxy, waiting for the signal to rise. The humans knew this. They'd known from the beginning. And now, with the captured fleet in their possession, they had everything they needed to find those allies. The council erupted into chaos. Some called for immediate action, demanding that we warn the rogue faction's remaining allies before it was too late. Others argued that interfering would only make us the humans' next target. I sat silently, torn between fear and fascination as the debate raged on. But the humans didn't wait for us to decide. The next phase of their operation began almost immediately. Using the rogue faction's own ships, the humans infiltrated their allies' territories with terrifying precision. It was a campaign of disruption, not destruction. Supply lines vanished overnight. Key outposts fell without a fight. Entire fleets disappeared as if they'd never existed. The galaxy watched in stunned silence as the humans dismantled an empire that had been years in the making. And yet, they did it without fanfare, without broadcasting their victories to the wider universe. To them, this wasn't a conquest. It was cleanup. But even as the rogue faction crumbled, a new question began to emerge. What would the humans do next? They had proven their strength, their cunning, their willingness to act decisively when threatened. But the lines between defense and dominance were beginning to blur, and the galaxy's fragile balance was shifting in ways no one could predict. Then, just as it seemed the conflict was drawing to a close, the final twist revealed itself. A single transmission, broadcast across all channels, originating from deep within human space. The message was simple, an invitation extended to the leaders of every major species in the galaxy. Join us. The words hung in the air, heavy with implications. This wasn't a demand or a threat. It was an offer, one that carried both promise and danger. The humans weren't just defending themselves anymore. They were building something, a coalition, an alliance, a new order. But why? As the council debated the message, theories began to circulate. Some believed the humans were offering protection, a chance to stand together against future threats. Others suspected something more sinister, a bid for control, disguised as unity. And then there were those who saw the truth, buried beneath the surface of the invitation. The humans had learned from the rogue faction. They'd seen the dangers of isolation, the vulnerabilities of being an outlier in a galaxy teeming with ambition. Their invitation wasn't just a call to unity, it was a calculated move to ensure their own survival. By bringing others into their fold, the humans could control the narrative, shape the galaxy's future on their terms. It was brilliant, audacious, and utterly terrifying. The council voted to send a delegation, and I was chosen to go. As our ship departed for human space, I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread mixed with curiosity. What would we find there? A utopia built on the ruins of those who had challenged humanity? Or a warning, a glimpse of what awaited those who failed to heed their laws? The journey felt like it stretched on forever, every passing moment filled with unanswered questions. And as we finally approached the human system, their armada visible in the distance, one thought consumed me. The humans had proven their strength, their strategy, their resilience. But now they were proving something far more dangerous. They weren't just masters of war. They were masters of the game itself. As our delegation approached the heart of human space, the tension aboard our vessel grew heavier with each passing moment. The human armada stretched across the system like an unbroken wall, their ships reflecting an eerie, quiet confidence. They made no hostile moves, no demands for clearance. Instead, they simply let us through, as though knowing we had no other choice. The planet below came into view: Earth, the fabled homeworld of humanity. Its surface shimmered with lights that seemed to pulse like a living entity, sprawling cities interwoven with green landscapes. There was a stark contrast between the stories of relentless warfare we'd heard and the almost serene vision before us. It was hard to reconcile the two. We landed in what appeared to be a massive diplomatic complex. The humans met us with calm, composed expressions, their uniforms simple yet commanding respect. They escorted us in silence, leading us through winding corridors until we reached a grand chamber filled with representatives from countless species. It seemed we weren't the only ones invited. The humans' invitation had not been selective. Every species with a stake in galactic politics had sent delegates, each of them likely grappling with the same mix of suspicion and curiosity. At the head of the chamber stood the human delegation, their leader stepping forward to address the gathering. Her voice was steady, measured, and powerful without being overbearing. She spoke of the rogue faction and the chaos it had threatened to unleash, explaining that humanity's actions were not driven by conquest but by necessity. Their intention, she said, was to ensure stability not just for themselves, but for the galaxy as a whole. Her words were carefully chosen, and it was clear she understood how precarious this moment was. Humanity was walking a fine line, presenting itself as a protector rather than a conqueror. But as her speech continued, it became evident that this wasn't just about defending against external threats. The humans were proposing something revolutionary: a united galactic council, one that would include all species willing to cooperate under a set of shared principles. The idea was ambitious, even idealistic, but it wasn't naive. The humans made it clear that this council wouldn't simply be a forum for debate. It would have real power, real enforcement capabilities. For some, the proposal was a lifeline, a chance to join something greater and avoid the fate of the rogue faction. For others, it was a threat, a subtle way for humanity to consolidate power while presenting itself as a benevolent force. As the discussions began, the room buzzed with whispered conversations. The delegates were split, their responses ranging from cautious optimism to outright skepticism. But beneath the surface of their arguments lay a common thread: fear. Fear of what would happen if they said no. I watched the humans closely as the debates unfolded. They didn't try to dominate the conversation or impose their will. Instead, they listened, offering carefully reasoned responses and addressing concerns with a calm demeanor that was almost unnerving. It was clear they had anticipated every argument, every hesitation. Hours turned into days as the discussions continued. The humans allowed the process to unfold naturally. And slowly but surely, their vision began to take shape. More and more delegates voiced their support, swayed by the promise of stability and the unspoken understanding that opposing humanity might not be a viable option. But even as the proposal gained traction, one question remained unanswered: what would happen to those who refused? The rogue faction had been destroyed, their allies scattered and their resources seized. But not every species would be willing to join this new order. Some valued their independence too much, while others harbored deep-seated mistrust of humanity. It was a question that hung over the negotiations like a storm cloud. And the humans, for all their diplomacy, offered no clear answer. As the final votes were cast, it became clear that the humans had won. The majority of the galaxy's major powers agreed to join the council, their signatures marking the beginning of a new era. But even in victory, there was an unease that lingered in the air. The humans had achieved their goal, but they hadn't revealed their full hand. Their actions had been precise, calculated, and impossible to predict. They had played the long game, and while they spoke of unity and cooperation, their true intentions remained a mystery. In the weeks that followed, the first meetings of the Galactic Council took place. The humans were careful not to dominate, allowing other species to take leadership roles and shape the Council's policies. But their influence was undeniable, woven into every decision and every initiative. The galaxy entered a period of unprecedented stability. The rogue factions' remnants were hunted down, their strongholds dismantled. Trade routes flourished, scientific collaborations reached new heights, and conflicts that had simmered for generations were finally addressed. And yet, there was always a sense that the humans were watching, guiding events from behind the scenes. They had proven their strength, their strategy, and their vision for the future. But they had also proven that they were willing to act decisively when their interests were threatened. As I returned to my homeworld, I couldn't help but reflect on what I had witnessed. The humans had offered the galaxy a choice: unite or face the consequences. For most, it had been an easy decision. But for others, it was a reminder that humanity's power was not just in their weapons or their tactics. It was in their ability to shape the galaxy itself, to bend it to their will without ever appearing to do so. The Council would stand as a symbol of unity, a beacon of hope for a better future. But beneath its surface lay the unspoken truth. The humans had won the war without firing a single shot. And in doing so, they had secured their place at the center of the galaxy's future. As the stars stretched out before me, I realized something else. The humans had changed, evolved in ways we couldn't fully understand. But so had we. Their actions had forced us to confront our own fears, our own weaknesses, and our own potential. Perhaps that was their greatest weapon of all. In the end, humanity's story wasn't just one of war and survival. It was a story of transformation, of finding strength in the face of adversity and using it to shape a better world. And as the galaxy moved forward, one thing was certain. The humans were no longer just a species to be feared. They were a force to be reckoned with.